People who have lived in the US and in Russia, where did you feel happier? Where was it better? What did you like and dislike about these countries? Which country was better economically? Which country would you prefer to live in? I was visiting my in-laws in North Carolina for 3 months. It was a long time ago, in 2004. The people were okay, although people are the same everywhere, but the living conditions were very difficult for me. I didn't have a driver's license, and they didn't have an extra car for me anyway, so I felt like baggage that I had to carry sometimes. I also didn't like the food in Russia. It's rude not to eat what your hosts offer, but sometimes I just couldn't. What kind of place would I want to live in? I don't understand people who want to live somewhere but don't want to move. If I wanted to live in the US, I would find a way to live in the US. Besides, we attend a Russian church here, so that is enough for me. My wife and I are introverts, so we don't really care what people think of us. But we feel Russian, and we don't worry too much about improving our accent. I moved to the US 7 years ago. First, I was a postdoc, then I worked at a contract research organization in the chemical industry, and now in intellectual property. Given that I have one life, I wanted to try living in a different country. And the US is very different in many aspects. For the moment, I'm doing well here in the US. So for now, I'm going to stay, work, and live in this country. The only thing I miss is my mom. But she's already come to visit me twice, and I just got back from Russia 2 weeks ago. I don't have much time to socialize with people, except for a very narrow circle of my relatives and my wife, so I wouldn't say I miss the Russian environment in the US. Besides, we attend a Russian church here, so that is enough for me. My wife and I are introverts, so we don't really care what people think of us. But we feel Russian, and we don't really worry about improving our accent. We deliberately use Russian variants of our names, refusing to use English ones. I have lived in the San Diego-Las Vegas area all my life. I spent 4 months in Cheboksary. Not used to the cold weather. But people here seem much happier and kinder. They are more affluent and have more money. Don't work as much and live a more fulfilling life. There's a good government here. The police don't hide in the bushes, they actually help. I don't have to stand in lines for 6 hours to get some government services. My wife was able to get a tooth done in 2 hours. In the US, I had 3 different cases on insurance, and in each of them, it took over 4 hours for me to at least get first aid. In Russia, you can walk, but in the US, everything is made for cars. Russia has healthier food without a lot of chemicals. I went through immigration control in 15 minutes. In the USA, it took my wife 3 hours. Going to the passport office took 10 minutes in Russia. It took my wife 2 hours. There is no such thing as unmarked police cars hiding in the bushes there to catch you violating. They don't tax everything in Russia like they do in the US. I spent 8+ years in the US government, and I never had the easy experience of communicating with the government as I did in Russia. I lived in New York for over 3 years and was never so happy when I came home. I spent days and weeks walking along Peter's embankments and grinning like an idiot. Almost everything in New York annoyed me. The huge prices, the smell of garbage and urine everywhere, and the piles of waste in the morning, the power limits on appliances in the apartment, the traffic jams in the morning in Manhattan, and I lived just on Sherman St. and stood on the George Washington Bridge for an hour every morning, the huge stone jungle with no trees except for the Central Park. I can't really remember anything good about New York except for a couple friends I made there. And that's basically true of all of the US. It's a shitty country, but the people there are generally nice. It may be a shitty country, but most Americans think New York is a shitty city. Also, concluding that the streets of the US smell like piss based on your experience in New York is like claiming Italy is flooded based on one trip to Venice. Note, I myself chose not to live in the US, but that has nothing to do with New York. I'm not Russian, but I had a Russian friend. The only big difference is that everything is obviously much more expensive in the US. You'll make more money, of course, but rent, food, and everything else is so much more expensive here that you don't feel richer. That said, politically, if you are an enemy to the government, you are safer here. There are no wars or conscription, which is why my friend moved here a few years ago. Also, there are still old Russian communities and Orthodox churches to join if it makes you feel at home. I grew up in the US and lived in Moscow for about 10 years. I never felt at home in Russia. I lived there from 2011 to 2018. I speak Russian fluently. Expats there were mostly attracted to poker and strip clubs, two things I despise. I prefer European Czech pubs and talking with friends. I love humor, and no expat or Russian has ever made me laugh, rather the opposite. Also, that rich people, middle class people, and poor people alike had a very unhealthy attitude towards money. I was encouraged that young educated Russians hipsters were bringing more flavor to food and music. I left there in 2018, right after the World Cup. Maybe it's gotten better there now. I don't know. I moved to Prague and immediately fell in love with it. Now I live in China. Very different vibe, but I really like it. On the attitude towards money, can you give examples or explain what you mean? Note, I grew up in the US in an upper middle income family, and we prided ourselves on not dreaming about money. Most of our neighbors were rich because of inherited wealth. It was considered mauvais to drive expensive cars. When I moved to Russia and lived with a poor-class Russian family, they only talked about one thing. What kind of car did they want for themselves? And what kind of car do I drive? When I became friends with wealthy Russians, they always brought it up too. Watches, suits, clothes, they were obsessed with it all. They bought shitty vodka Grey Goose just because it was expensive. I also had holes in my clothes. I hate throwing stuff away. And there were times one of the guys would take me aside and ask me if my job was okay. Same shit happened with my expat friends in Moscow. When I told them I ride the subway, they looked at me like I was poor. They couldn't believe I didn't have a car or a driver. That's pretty normal in New York. Edit, I'll add one more thing. When I was in high school, I worked crappy jobs, mowing lawns, working on a maintenance crew. My father, the head of a commercial bank, wanted me to learn the value of money and hard work. When I told the Russians about this, they said, "Oh my God, why did your father do that to you?" Another thing that happened to me often in Moscow at the grocery store, if I asked another customer where a certain product was, he would look at me with horror and say, "You what? I don't work here," and ran away. It was as if they were ashamed of such a misunderstanding. Hey, Russian brother. I hit 30. Born and raised in Russia. Lived there until I was about 14. Then lived in Europe until I was 20. Came to the US for college. Eventually built a good career and stayed here. All in all, I've been here for a little over 10 years now. My Russian accent is 95% gone. At this point, I speak English better than Russian. I first moved to Boston, studied there. The people there seemed incredibly nice to me. Later, I learned that people in the North are considered quite rude. Now I live in Florida. Oh yeah, the people there are nice as hell. Even a little annoyingly nice. I like it here a lot. Pros: generally happier people here. Less toxic. It's a peaceful place. Especially in the South, huge variety of good food and cuisine. Ozon Russian Amazon is not even close to Amazon in quality and quantity of goods. From the salary of my first job after college, I was able to live independently and rent an apartment. It covered all my bills. Of course, you won't be able to rent an apartment in the city center, but in the suburbs, quite realistic. Travel? Oh my! People outside of the US just don't realize the sheer size of the US. Each region is very different from the other. California is nothing like Florida at all. Massachusetts is nothing like Texas. New York is not at all like Arizona. Driving long distances and short distances is much easier and more relaxed. Yes, commuting in San Francisco/Boston/New York is asshole, but you don't have to live there. You can live anywhere. Unlike Russia, where the whole movement is in Moscow, the US is wildly decentralized. Each state has two major cities with lots of jobs. Minuses: lots of junk food, a lot of cheap junk food. Healthy food costs much more. It's very easy to spend too much money on streaming services, various subscriptions. It's such a common theme around here that I've really noticed that I spend too much money. Oh, it's only $10-15 a month for a service, and you end up spending thousands of bucks a year on all that shit. Depending on where you live, you drive a lot. For example, living in Florida, you can drive 15-20 minutes down the highway to get to some major mall. When my parents came to visit me in Florida last year, they were blown away by the distance we had to drive. That's both a plus and a minus, depending on the person. People in the US drive faster. In Florida, I average 90 miles per hour, 140 plus km/h on the highway. There are no such speeds in Russia, but you get used to it. Politics. Lots of politics. A lot of drama. It's like a war between two sides. Both sides lie. Both sides cheat. There's a lot of diehard fans who believe in bullshit. Difficulties I've encountered coming here for the first time in my life at 20 years old, I knew no one. No one. You will have to make all new connections from scratch. It will be hard to find your first job. I worked very hard as a student to get a decent resume, and it worked out in the end. But I know many other international students who couldn't find a good job and had to move back. They needed a decent job whose salary could cover their student visa. Cultural differences and language barrier. Although this wasn't a problem for me, as I'm not some arrogant asshole, the differences are definitely there. As for the language, I went to a British school, so I already had pretty cool English. You don't go into a foreign monastery with your own rules. It's an adventure. But if you are prepared to go through the adaptation period, you will like it here. I studied at an American university in 2002. 2003 on an exchange program funded by the US State Department, just like Simon and Lowell. I come from a poor dystopian industrial city and had never traveled outside my region before. What was a pleasant shock to me was the prosperity, friendliness, and safety of our college town. Obviously, things have changed in both countries since then, and I don't look at the state of affairs in the US with the rose-colored glasses I would have if I were in my 20s now. But I would still prefer to live in the US if given two options. I've been living in the Netherlands for the last 12 years.